Thank you everyone for joining us this evening on this summer's evening. Really appreciate you taking the time to listen to these amazing photographers speak and be part of this conversation. As Claire said, this evening's event and the exhibition came about whenever Claire Gallagher gave this amazing and very generous paper as part of the Northern Irish Art Network Symposium on Queer and Feminist Practice back in January. And at the end of her presentation, we just thought, that's an exhibition, that needs to be an exhibition. This work needs to be shared. And I think it's an interesting point. And I keep talking about this idea of underrepresented narratives. And obviously this idea of talking about underrepresented narratives in fine art photography. But I think an important note to make is these narratives are represented. Tonight is about saying that artists are looking at them, photographers are looking at them, they are representing these stories, but maybe they are not platformed or celebrated in the way that they should be, especially here in Northern Ireland. So hopefully with evenings like tonight and the exhibition that Claire has curated in the Golden Thread Gallery, we are starting to truly give these conversations and the work made by these artists the platform that they deserve. So the format of this evening will be that our three photographers are going to give 10-minute presentations each. I am going to give you some information on each of them now, and then we're going to go straight into the presentations. Claire Gallagher will speak first, then Emma Campbell, and then ending with Richard Gosnold. And then after that, we're going to go straight into our Q&A between myself and the three speakers. So please, as Claire said, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A throughout their talks, and then we'll look at them and gather them at the end for conversation. So just to give you a bit of information about each of our speakers this evening, Dr. Claire Gallagher, who's the curator, as we said, of the Bigger Picture at the Golden Thread Gallery, is lecturer for the MFA and the BA of Photography with Video at UU, University of Ulster. She is widely published in her field and has exhibited extensively, both nationally and internationally. And she is also a member of the Northern Irish Art Network and is on the board of the Belfast Photo Festival. Her practice examines ways of making visible the unseen work of home. Her recently published photo book, which is amazing, The Second Shift, is out now and has been featured in the likes of The Guardian. Dr. Emma Campbell, who will speak next, is an activist, artist, academic, and member of the Turner Prize-winning Array Collective. She is based in Belfast. Her work addresses photography as an activist tool, an artist practice, and as a reflexive academic inquiry in the movement for abortion rights. Emma also happens to be the co-convener of Alliance for Choice. And then our third speaker this evening is Richard Gosnold, who is a photographic artist based in Northern Ireland. In his work, Gosnold addresses state-sanctioned violence, forced birth, baby loss, lack of access to compassionate healthcare, and he seeks to communicate the complexities of political decisions around bodily autonomy, which are commonly communicated as binary ideas. And now I'm going to hand straight over to Claire Gallagher, and I look forward to our conversation after all the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you all for coming. It's really great to be part of the festival's series of talks. Sorry. So I'm getting over a cold and I'm trying not to cough, but I'll try to mute myself if I do. I'm going to talk about the development of Northern Irish photography and its particular sensibility. It's a very strong photographic tradition that we have and one that we're proud of. But the imbalance of voices and subject matter in its history has really become difficult to ignore. My own research is concerned with the invisibility and the marginalization of subjects and voices, particularly those of women. So I'm conscious of these omissions, and out of that, I curated this exhibition from listening to and nurturing the students that I'm really lucky to work with. So this exhibition presents new photography from Northern Ireland, which responds to these gaps. It's pushing at the edges and expanding the field of representation. So in Northern Ireland, we have issues with photography, it's fair to say, as a form of representation. During the Troubles, the ordinary people were subordinated to the government, terrorists, military, police, media, and how we were depicted was usually in the hands of others, often outsiders who were parachuted into a conflict they didn't understand to get pictures that fitted an external agenda. Pictures that were dramatic enough to sell papers, that fulfilled viewers' expectations of a neat conflict, but left little room for complexity in the narratives. And these are probably the better ones, I have to say, by Magnum photographers. So the mismatch between what we saw in real life and on TV and in newspapers caused us to collectively develop a mistrust of images and an awareness of the agendas that lie behind them. As a child, Willie Doherty witnessed Bloody Sunday and was deeply affected by the misrepresentation of what he'd seen with his own eyes by what was shown on the news. So homegrown Northern Irish photography initially emerged in response to this mistrust of images. So some examples, and this is Willie Doherty. So moving far from the news images, taking a poetic rather than documentary approach, and using some of that very loaded language that we're familiar with in Northern Ireland. My colleague Donovan Wiley, who used an elevated viewpoint to take out the emotion of our relationship to these oppressive structures of British watchtowers, which had overlooked us for decades. Paul Seawright, who revisited sites of sectarian murders 15 years previously and used texts from newspaper articles about how they were communicated. So these are examples of a turn towards the subtler effects of conflict, particularly photographing in the aftermath as a challenge to news as spectacle, and really trying to show that trouble, of course, doesn't end when the cameras leave. And there have been some really interesting publications about Northern Irish work, books by Colin Graham, Declan Long, and the Golden Threads exhibition last year that examine and explain that history and sensibility. But the extent of the gender imbalance is really hard to ignore. And it's also replicated across institutions. So the Ulster Museum's collection has more photographic works in it by one man than by all of the women combined. And of course, there are other voices missing in that. Queer and trans voices, people with disabilities, migrants, and other subjects are missing, like home, family, sexuality, conflict from a female perspective. And recent Northern Irish literature is ahead of us in this. You've got Milkman by Anna Burns and Lucy Caldwell's writing. So these omissions, they deeply matter because they say that some experiences, subjects, and actually people don't matter. And my own research is concerned with the nature of omissions, the blind spots within wider culture, the subjects which aren't shown or studied or talked about. And in my case, it's the hidden work of home that women do in the second shift on top of their real work. So photography is really a bit of a problematic art form. It's full of contradictions. It's probably the most democratic and accessible visual medium. We nearly all have a smartphone with us all the time. It enables us to document almost anything, yet what is seen as appropriate subject matter tends to congeal into ever narrower and rigid tropes, like more sunsets. So I lean on the theorist Jacques Rancière in my research and his concern with how voices and subject matter are, as he terms it, policed by various gatekeepers like traditions, expectations, power. And this produces what he conceives of as the distribution of the sensible as in what can be sensed or heard, felt, seen, noticed. It's the fabric of recognisable experience. It's what's discussed in conversation, depicted in TV programs, what's heard as music and exhibited in art galleries. And there's an important reciprocal relationship here because we express what we experience, but we only tend to recognize something as an experience when we've already seen or heard it expressed in everyday life in our culture. And it's really through expression that we're able to interpret it as experience and not just as unintelligible background noise. And we're all familiar with the archaic diagnosis of hysteria, in which women's illnesses and complaints about oppression were defined as lunatic ravings in a cultural conspiracy of silence to delegitimize their experiences and voices. But the changing history of hysteria shows that a particular distribution of the sensible is not cast in stone. A dislocation in it occurs when people, things, or experiences gain an audience or presence and become noticeable. So as a photography school, we aim for what in our lived experiences is significant, and we examine and question and represent that with photography and video. And we're really focused on work that is made with authenticity and understanding that the personal is political. So in putting this together, I divided the work in the exhibition into 3 themes. And the first was home, which is a really significant subject in Northern Irish work. This is Shannon Ritchie, who spent years trying to find acceptance of the entrenched sectarianism of the housing estate she grew up on, but has now begun to articulate her anger at it, her refusal of it, and at how her generation of ceasefire babies is voiceless amid the louder, more powerful voices of the people who left them in this mess. And she's also angry at photography for privileging the detached male gaze, hence her lo-fi interventions into the images. Maria Przybylska considers the alienation and precariousness of home for renters against cultural expectations of home as a source of stability. And her feelings of insecurity emerge through the oddness and threat of these defamiliarized objects in the domestic setting. Molly Martin's experiences of epilepsy meant her body experienced states that she was unconscious of, disrupting her sense of being at home in her own body. So in this video work, she pushes her body to explore what happens beyond its limits. Ryan Allen is a queer photographer who grew up with a terminally ill mother, and his father was her carer. And he realized that statistically, it was a depressingly rare thing for a man to do. And he wanted to make caring as a male activity visible and valuable, as well as documenting its impact on home and family. Sophie Riddell's video work uses warmth and humor, which is a tricky thing to get right, and she does it brilliantly, to consider the table as a center of making meaning and memory in family life. Aisling Kane comes from Ardoyne and felt her home was constantly misrepresented in the media as a place of riots and violence. And so she sought to show the other side of it, the warmth and acceptance and trust that she experienced there. So the second theme concerns the policing of the female, queer or trans body. This is Emma Campbell and her collage series, which interrogates the colonial and religious factors preventing access to reproductive healthcare. So we'll hear more of that from Emma. Adela Puderkova turned towards taboos of the female body, focusing on fat. She etched in stretch marks, and she imbued her work with body odor as well, which was a really smart response to the isolation from other bodies in the early months of the pandemic. Evie Williamson's video plays with expectations of gender, using her body and harnessing the power of the abject to challenge limiting beliefs about women. Shane O'Neill made a poignant short film reflecting on the agony of growing up gay in a religiously conservative household. Gareth Sweeney expresses the joy of belonging, and he shares portraits of his queer tribe or his chosen family. And Charlie Beer, as a queer trans man, has a really interesting perspective on masculinity, having been both observer and insider. And he's looking for the visual language to express a sense of self as becoming amid struggles to be accepted. And so the final section considers conflict with a small c, This is Joanne Mullen, who made work about a women's refuge using her experiences as a domestic violence survivor. It's really sensitive work looking at the difficulty for the refuges, needing to create a homely space, which is also secure and institutional, comfortable and impersonal. Sarah Tahan, who's a PhD researcher, and she examines the archives of war for evidence of the Black soldiers who were omitted from the historical narratives. And she looks for ways to represent their voice and reinsert their presence. And Richard then, he'll be talking. And I think in terms of making visible what had been hidden and not discussed, very, very little comes close to being as powerful and effective as Richard's work. It's about his and his wife's agonizing experience of being forced by Northern Ireland's abortion ban to carry a baby to term that would be born dead. And they worked a lot with Emma, so it's great to have the two of them talking as well, to make their story audible in the media and in court, and making visible through the photographic work. And it's a heartbreaking but essential book, which you can get in the Golden Thread Gallery, by telling and retelling their story, though it no doubt costs them each time. They've helped to change the law. So, this is a very partial selection of the hundreds of students who've graduated from photography since 2007, but it demonstrates a clear turn towards the embodied subjective and haptic vision, more associated with the female or queer gaze. We aim to develop a more nuanced reckoning with Northern Ireland's conflict, as well as ongoing social issues, and build a more diverse canon going forward, which represents the voices, perspectives, and experiences of Northern Ireland in photography. Thank you.
Hi, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Thanks for that, Claire. It was a really nice introduction. I am going to talk a little bit about my work that's in the exhibition, a bigger picture, and one of the collages is also, or was also, in the Ulster Museum collage, A Political Act show. So bear with me whilst I share my screen. Okay. So I'm particularly going to be talking about one piece of work, which is the collage work. I have made other projects that are around the exact same topic because I am obsessed. So just for a little bit of personal background, I was working in the photographic industry in London for just over a decade and wanted to come back to do a master's in photography at Ulster. And when I came back, I suppose, having moved away as a teenager, I was still really shocked at how strict the law was here. Very quickly became involved with Alliance for Choice, and through them made a lot of contacts and did my first body of work. I sometimes joke that whenever I'm speaking to an art audience, I explain abortion. When I'm speaking to an activist audience, I explain the art and the photography. So just for a little bit of background, it's widely known that especially Northern Europe, at least 1 in 3 women and pregnant people will have one abortion in their lifetime. Approximately 70,000 women and pregnant people travel to England from the north of Ireland since 1970, which for context is the same size or bigger than most electoral constituencies in Northern Ireland. And importantly for the project that I'm going to talk about, 1861 was the implementation of the Offences Against the Person Act. So this was a British law, and it took effect in anywhere that was part of Britain or Britain's colonies at that time, which obviously included Ireland. And interestingly, out of 18 Commonwealth countries in Africa subjected to this law, there are still 11 that have statutes directly derived from it. In most of these countries, it outlaws sodomy or being homosexual. So for me, as a queer person as well, these topics have always been really linked. So sexuality and coloniality have a really problematic relationship. And I'd already done, trying to move forward. I'd already made a project. There's a still from the video in the background there about people making the decision to travel over to England. It was kind of a broad project called When They Put Their Hands Out Like Scales. I made a video about the decision. I made another piece of work, which was the stills. And then I also made the collage project, which we'll go on to next. I think situating myself as an activist and an artist is really important to understand the work. It also kind of situates where activism went and was going to in Ireland as a whole at the time I was making the project. When I started this project, the Journeys project, not only had no photographers been addressing abortion or the control of sexuality, very few artists had, apart from a handful of performance artists in the mid-90s. So there was really an overwhelming silence about abortion, even though it was such a pressing issue for people. It's more common than getting your tooth out. It's more common than getting your appendix out. So for me, it felt really urgent and I really had to do something about it. So one project wasn't enough. Sometimes the work that I've tried to do with a slightly more activist bent has been quite heavily censored, and 40 of these posters, which I put up the night before Culture Night in 2016, 38 of them were defaced or torn down the next morning. So I think I've always found that really interesting in a country that is happy to have guns and paramilitary violence glorified on walls everywhere. And the minute I have something that even vaguely looks like genitalia, it gets ripped down. Obviously the swearing doesn't help, but like, don't tell me that there's no swearing on the walls of graffiti in Northern Ireland. Another project here is the Appropriate Hobby, which is trying to insert images of women and potentially pregnant people into the debate about abortion, because quite often the anti-choice movement really take over the visual space in the campaign for abortion rights with their kind of heavily manipulated fetal imagery. So this project really came from my role as an activist. There's an organization called Women on Web, and they provide abortion pills, so early medical abortion pills, which can be taken up to 13 weeks under the advice of the World Health Organization. They provide these to people across the world where they live in countries where it's illegal or inaccessible. And we've been working, Alliance for Choice have been working really closely with them in order to facilitate abortions for people in the island of Ireland. In fact, activists in the north were providing most of the rest of the island, because the packages that were coming into the south were more quickly and intercepted by customs and the post. So we would receive them here, we would get the addresses of people who needed them in the south and across the north, and we would repackage them and send them on. For another bit of context, in 2017, whilst the International Women's Day rally was happening with famous feminist Angela Davis in attendance, the PSNI, or the Northern Irish Police, raided some of our activists' homes, laptops, workshops and studios to try and find evidence of these pills. No arrests were made, but some young people were arrested for taking the pills a couple of months after. So my imagination of what to do about this was, I guess, quite frustrated. And I got a call from Rebecca Humperts, who is the Dutch woman who runs Women on Web. And she said, when she found out I was an artist, I think her mum was an artist and an activist, and she said, we have all these archives of photos and we don't really know what to do with them. And if I give you access, I give you permission to do whatever you want with them. So, which is a sort of a joy to hear, but also you don't really know what you're getting. When I got the images, I'm going to go forward a little bit through some of them. When I got the images, they're all really tiny digital files because they were taken on very low res digital cameras, probably in the early 2000s. And so how do you make something out of these kind of low res images, but being so excited about having access to this archive? What are you going to do? So I thought a lot about the 1861 date, and I thought about, I'd used collage in some other projects. And so I thought about, I went into the National Library Museum's archive for Ireland and looked up photos around the same years, around 1861, and was trying, I suppose, the previous project had been talking about people's individualized and personal journey. And this project was really trying to pin down the source of this, I guess, this discrimination, and do it in a way that I suppose called attention to some of the previous practices. I suppose it's a bit more of a nod to people like Sean Hillen or Victor Sloan, where it's trying to pull at threads of the colonialization and pull at threads of kind of these very powerful state structures and try and illustrate them. I mean, mine aren't as amusing as Sean Hillen's, but certainly there's a way of playing with the image to try and illustrate this complexity and this layeredness. Also, they were always previously shown with one of the other bodies of work. So one of the other, either the film or normally the film or the individual journey. And this is an image, the container in this image from the Women in Web archives is the medical facility that was licensed as an abortion provider, and which for years, for over a decade, they took around the world and shipped it in international waters near countries where abortion was illegal. So ourselves and places like Morocco, Ecuador. And interestingly, to allow the ship to bring this medical facility to different countries, it was registered as an art installation. So I like this kind of back and forth circle of activist artist practice. This was a really significant moment of change for abortion in Ireland in terms of pushing the conversation up to the surface again after the really depressing referendum on introducing the 8th Amendment. On the left here, we have an image of, I'm sure everybody is familiar with anti-abortion protesters. This particular person also features in the film Vessel, which is a documentary about Rebecca Gompertz of Women on Web, which I would recommend. And I suppose I'm really trying to play with this kind of, I guess, the louder voice of the people who are in the minority. So across Ireland, north and south, the number of people who are against abortion in all circumstances is commonly under 10%, so it's around 8%. And yet we hear so much from them, and we hear from them, and they're given equal weight to the amount of people who support abortion in various different circumstances. And they really don't consider the lives and the impact and the social networks and the needs of people who can't be pregnant or can't be parents at that time. And then on the right, we have the landing of British military in Ireland. And I think this is really interesting because quite often when, as Array did over in Jerwood in London a couple of years ago when we had an exhibition, there's this sentiment that, we didn't have abortion yet because we're so backward here. And of course, our religion and so forth has a lot to play. But we have to remember where this law came from. And this law didn't come from Irish people initially. In fact, in most countries throughout Europe, and even the Catholic Church up until 1836 believed that abortion was fine up until quickening, which is when you can feel a kicking or a moving inside. And so even though Britain has moved ever so slightly past some of its colonial practices, not all of them, it also has progressed on in terms of social issues, but the eruption of a civil war in a country quite regularly means that social issues are always put to the back burner. So it's just, I suppose, using a visual language to think about this. So there were images from the inside of the medical facility or the container, and this is kind of mixed up with the church here to, I guess, give you the comparison and some of the activist stuff. And really playing around with these images was again, as you can see here, the United Ireland, but all of the activists waiting for the boat to arrive and help all the women of Ireland. I am going to sum up here so that we can let the next person speak and stop sharing. And we have Richard next, which hopefully flows on quite nicely.
Thanks very much, Emma. Hello, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to speak a little bit about the work that's currently shown in the Golden Thread. It's my work, It Starts With Silence. And I'm going to start off with some audio, which I'll expand on after I've played it.
Can you imagine what it's like to find yourself pregnant with your first child, to have all the scans going very well, and then you get to the 19-week scan and you're told that your child has full Edwards syndrome, which means that she is not going to survive, and then the next impact or the next blow that comes is that you're told that you're not going to be able to do anything about it. In fact, you're going to be forced to carry this dying fetus right through to full term. And then can you imagine what it's like to go through every day, every hour, every minute, knowing that child's going to die, to not be able to sleep at night? And can you imagine then what it's like whenever your child does die in utero, and to not be able to give birth to her until 5 days later? And can you imagine then having to bury that child into the earth and walk away? Can you imagine the level of hatred and oppression that you feel as a human being, realizing that the state that you live in has done this to you, and all for no reason? Because while pretending that this is all about saving babies, there is no child to be saved when it comes to fetal abnormality. So then you have to ask yourself, what is it about?
Okay, so that was my wife Denise, and that was a podcast, an excerpt from a podcast that she recorded on the day that abortion was decriminalised in October 2019. I'll expand on that now. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay, so just to expand a little bit, we were told around 20 weeks that the baby we were expecting would be incredibly ill, and if she survived until birth, she would suffer horrendous pain and then die. And at that time, abortion was illegal in Northern Ireland. And the work that I made, It Starts With Silence, is the reality of state-sanctioned violence, of forced birth, of lack of access to abortion. And I had to ask myself, how do I make a photographic work which addresses all of the complexities of our situation? So I began making images about 9 months after our baby had been born dead. And it was hard because I couldn't find anything from which to derive joy. I didn't care about anything. And then how do you make photos when you simply don't care about anything? Nothing mattered except trying to keep Denise from going over the edge. And we were both mentally unstable, and our relationship was suffering as well. I was empty and Denise was broken. And I had no ideas what pictures to make, but I knew that I needed to start something. So I began in the solitude of nature, which has been a constant crutch throughout my life. And I had sought places where I could avoid people, and I took a camera and shot intuitively while trying to figure out how to cope with the situation. And it's worth mentioning that we were living in England and we moved to Northern Ireland. Denise was desperate to return to Northern Ireland, and I understood her longing. But after everything we'd been through, I wanted to hate this place. And the landscape, which previously had provided me with comfort, was now the object of my hatred. And where I once saw beauty, I saw oppression and cruelty and pain. And it was as if the curtain had been lifted. And there's no spectacle in these photographs. They're images which will invite you to come with me into my headspace and into my world. And I set myself a task of trying to illustrate how I was feeling with photography as my voice. And I needed to capture this absence, the kind of absence which arrives during intense grief and the loss of something so fragile and so precious, but that was never meant to be. A person who we loved, but we never knew. And we would never, ever know our daughter. My only memories of her are of pain and of sorrow. And any physical trace of her is disappearing over time. And I wanted to visualize this feeling of desolate isolation that Denise and I were both experiencing. And the initial images, they reflect these emotions. And there were many aspects that I needed to unpack. But what I wanted to represent visually were the issues that forced us to this point and how the system had failed Denise and me. And I needed to reconcile that, and it's difficult. I mean, I accepted that our baby was going to die. The moment the doctors told us the gravity of her condition, I understood it, and I was ready for her death. But what I can't comprehend is the level of pure evil that wants to torture another sentient human being by forcing them to endure the trauma of giving birth to a dead baby. And in certain images, I'm probing ideas which are created to control us. They're social constructs used for conditioning and indoctrination. And these ideas are ingrained into our subconscious from childhood, and they're employed to manipulate the way we think about things. And sometimes these things are left deliberately for us to find when we're out walking. And then others appear by chance, and they're alluding to ideas and concepts which I don't believe in. I think they're social constructs, and they're used to maintain a level of subservience. And these ideas are embedded into our psyche, and they become apparent when we search for them. And I needed to reflect upon the harshness of this cruel law, which forced us further into a tragedy than we wanted, than we needed to be. And the patriarchal system that wants to punish women. And I became more focused. And it was always going to be a work of activism, but perhaps not the most direct or expected form. After the baby had died, Denise contacted loads of different pro-choice groups, and we marched with them, but I was never going to make artwork at these events. For me, they were a collective defiance against oppression. And also Denise and I, when we were in the marches, we were really affected emotionally, and we both found the events really, really intense. And I knew that the work I was making needed to be more nuanced and more personal. It is informed by activism. It's informed by conversations conducted in small rooms behind closed doors. And Denise and I engaged in a number of conversations in different environments. As activists, we campaigned with Amnesty International, and we lobbied politicians in Westminster, and we took this book. And this book isn't an artwork, but we showed the politicians our story. It contains photos from the hospital, photos that very few people have seen, very graphic photos. And the photos in this book, I really used photography. And I use techniques to show the full horror of what we had experienced. And this mind map was something that Denise and I made before we really knew, before we understood how the law would stop us making an informed decision and a rational decision. And during these conversations, it was clear the effect that personal accounts can have on people and decision makers, and how important they are for helping to implement change. And I decided that this work would be made with the same sentiment. And the big bonus with that approach is that the patriarchy don't like it. A patriarchal system dictates that sensitivity is to be avoided. And I wanted to find other ways to try to undermine and subvert the patriarchy. As an activist, personally, I think come at them from as many different directions as possible. You take to the streets, you hold rallies, be visible in numbers, write to politicians, vent your frustration, speak with your family and peers, educate them, do all of the things that the patriarchy expect, and then question them. Make policymakers defend their position face to face and look into their eyes and tell them the truth. Make them defend the indefensible. Show them the cruelty that they inflict and the futility. Make them see that you know there's no legitimate reason to force somebody to endure a situation like this and to have their life shattered. The moment our dead baby was born, in that instant, I understood that I'd never really known the cruelty of a system which punishes women for being women. And I saw it, and I was horrified at what I saw. I was devastated for my loss, but none of that compared to the sustained violence that had been inflicted on Denise. And it was unbearable to witness, and it still makes me angry now. And in the dark, silent hours that passed, as Denise lay cradling our dead baby, drifting in and out of consciousness, I moved closer, as close as I have ever been to understanding the cruelty that women are forced to experience in our sexist world. And the patriarchy will try to defend their position. Perhaps they'll quote from the Bible, they'll blame promiscuity, the sexual revolution, sinful lives. They'll turn out phrases which blame women for crisis pregnancies. They'll tell us that both lives matter. And failing those tactics, they'll revert to a favorite trope in patriarchal propaganda. Emotions are feminine and femininity is viewed as weakness. Well, here's the power. And it's no secret to activists. We know that the truth hurts, it's effective, it's powerful, and it affects change. This is an excerpt from an essay, and there was a series of essays written in response to the Supreme Court in the US and the concern that they'll overturn Roe v. Wade. And Anne Enright is commenting on the vote to repeal the 8th Amendment to the Irish Constitution, which made abortion illegal. And she's saying that more than 3/4 of voters in 2018 said that they had been influenced by personal stories they had heard in the media or from people they knew. And thanks, Zelda, for sending that. During our activism, I recognised the power of personal stories. I saw it in people's faces, the way they held themselves. I saw it in the way they covered their mouths and the look in their eyes. And I understood how stories, although difficult to hear and tell, can lead to a shift in perception and encourage more empathy towards ideas which many may not have considered in depth. And I know that these conversations lead to change, and this body of work and the book was made with this in mind. And I consider it a tender protest, a work of subversion. So it is a deeply personal work, and probably more so for Denise than I. There's a few photos of me in the book, and I was conscious of this, and I needed to redress the balance. So I thought, how can I man up and share my vulnerability along with hers? So the prose I wrote for the book is an offering. It's an offering from me to her and to all who feel they have no voice, to all who have been suffocated by oppression and taboo and stigma. And it's a showing of solidarity, of hope, of love, And to Denise, who never asked for any of this, but continues to be the driving force behind our activism and the gel that holds us together, I'll borrow from Hannah Gadsby. And there is nothing stronger than a broken woman who has rebuilt herself. And that's the truth. And that's me. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you to you and Denise for sharing your story. As Claire said, it's an essential piece of work, and we all really admire your bravery for sharing your story. And I hope you know the impact that it's had on people in the exhibition and us. And it's an honor to even just be part of an exhibition that shows this work, but thank you. And thank you to all three of you, because I think essential is a good word, because all that you're doing is essential in sharing your own work and sharing the work of others. Because as we said at the beginning, you know, these narratives are being shown, but it's important that people are aware that these are being shown. And if everybody's happy, we're going to sort of go into some questions, just as the audience maybe is gathering. I know someone commented, like, you know, this is such an amazing event and there's so many amazing conversations happening. It's going to take a little minute, I think, for people to gather themselves and maybe put some questions together. But in the meantime, I have a question for you, just sort of thinking about obviously the subjects that all of you are showing in your own work, and obviously that Claire's sharing in the wider exhibition as well. Just from a viewer's perspective, they're sort of a lot more intuitive and emotional, and therefore more accessible than a lot of maybe artworks that people are used to seeing. And that maybe does encourage a lot more of a reaction, and people are maybe seeing themselves a lot more in their work. And I'd just be really interested to know sort of how your work has been received. Maybe Richard, obviously I know you've had issues sort of getting this project seen, but also just maybe how you feel about just how audiences are reacting to these subjects of work compared to maybe what they're more used to, the more majority kind of narrative that we are used to seeing in fine art photography. Maybe Richard, if you want to answer that, because I know.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, one thing, you never know what's going to happen when you put a body of work out there. You never know who's going to see it, or you know what the response is going to be. In terms of response, I really was overwhelmed with people writing to me and sharing their experiences as well. And you know, in the book, I write about how I have changed, and I have changed. You know, there's parts of me which have changed for the better, and there's parts of me which I'm constantly battling with because I'm angry at this place still. And I sometimes I listen to myself and I'm saying illogical things, and it's because I still have this ingrained anger, which I'm still trying to work through. But the comfort I got actually was receiving so many messages from people telling me of their experience. And you know, Denise and I, we pretty much went through this alone when we were actually going through the pregnancy and then the death. And coincidentally, actually, just to set some context about the true barbarity of the law, so our baby died on Wednesday, the 15th of June, 2016. So that would be today. Okay, so 6 years ago today she died. And she was born on Sunday. So from now until Sunday, Denise had to carry a dead baby. And it's sick. I mean, what kind of vile person wants to really force somebody to endure that? And, you know, we've had to work through a lot of different things, and it did have an effect on our relationship. You know, in a relationship, you have ups and downs, and then if one of you is up and the other is down, you kind of pull the other one up, or you pull together. When you're both down, it becomes really, really torturous. And you know, we both had some very, very low moments. And the truth is, you don't get help. You just can't get help. So as long as you carry that baby to term, that's it. You know, the people are happy. You can't get help. Denise got some counselling. I couldn't get anything. I was offered medication, which I refused. And it's a complete shambles, the whole thing.
Oh, definitely. I think just the fact that, and I'm just seeing in the comments here, everybody's just sort of blown away by you sharing your story, and also just the need for the story to be shared more, and the fact that, you know, you've taken the bravery to kind of come forward and be so public about it, but maybe it's going to help people who haven't been able to do that. So it definitely, you know, thank you for doing that so much. Claire, I just wonder what you were thinking, what your thought is on that kind of question of sort of just, yeah, these kind of stories being shown, kind of how they're received, and if that is as someone who, you know, has been working in photography and obviously has a lot of students and has sort of seen how work is received and by audiences, do you think there is a difference with this kind of work and yeah, these more personal and kind of intuitive stories?
I mean, I think it's really important that the subjects which haven't been shown before are showing you to make that experience visible and something that's recognizable, so that other people can go, oh yeah, I know that. I see myself reflected back. I see a way of talking about something or showing something. You know, and working in the university, I saw Richard go through this at the time, and I can tell you that it changed the conversations completely. You know, like, you know, Richard was so kind of calm and steadfast in being present. You know, you were present and you spoke of these things that people hadn't felt able to talk about, or hadn't even, you know, the blinkers were so firmly on that they couldn't hear them. I know that a lot of people just couldn't hear what Emma was saying, you know, previous to that. And I think that it really started to make it sayable. It made it sayable, and the conversations that we had in the classroom changed dramatically over the next, you know, maybe even a year, because of that. So I think it is really important for people to share, and to see that subjects are actually subjects, you know, that they can't be written off because they don't fit into the paradigm of, you know, the important subject or the photographic subject, or, you know, or whatever, what people talk about in soaps, you know, so that kind of thing, you know, gets highlighted, you know, when a subject which has been ignored is mentioned in like the Archers or something like that, you know. And so all of these bits of culture, you know, the more that we kind of diversify what they show and who gets to speak in them or to be visible in them, I think it helps to create that broader picture that most of us are part of, and not just the kind of narrow set.
Mm-hmm. I think it's definitely that importance of people being able to see themselves in a gallery, which maybe hasn't happened for a long period of time. And
yeah, I mean, can I just expand on that as well? I mean, obviously we know taboos, the more we talk about these issues and the more that they're seen, it kind of becomes less of a big issue, and people are more willing to share their stories, and then that's hopefully how things become normalized.
Mm-hmm. Yes, hopefully. And I think definitely even with conversations like this, I'm just saying, because most people comment and even just in the chat are just saying how important it is even that we're having these conversations in such a public platform. Sort of, I'm aware that sort of activism has definitely become a theme of this evening's talk, which obviously delights me. But just sort of thinking, actually maybe touching on what you were saying, Emma, just about sort of, you've obviously like a wide sort of multidisciplinary practice as well. And just what, if any of you have a comment on how photography does seem to be this maybe more accepted space for conveying activism, and just sort of thinking back to you saying, Emma, about sort of other areas of your work that have been censored, but maybe does that not happen as much within a photographic practice? Does photography sort of allow for this truth telling in a far more maybe palatable, maybe isn't the right word, but in a way that people kind of can engage with more maybe than they can in other art forms? So
I suppose a bit like Claire was saying, there's a lot of paradoxes in photography, and I think whilst it is accepted that a lot of photographers would be concerned with social justice and social issues, and you know, if you look at the World Press Awards, that's 100% what it's all about, issues like this. There's also what Claire mentioned about what gets seen, or who allows work to be shown, or who funds work. Like I can't tell you how many times, and Richard had similar experiences, where you've tried to get funding to show work or even to make work, and once it's about this, like certainly locally within this country, nobody wanted to touch it. Publicly funded galleries, even in the South, and it ended up being a private gallery that gave me a solo exhibition. And I think that's important to remember as well, that quite often you become an activist because you're squeezed into the only space that exists in public life for you to make these conversations happen. And there was two things that I thought of. One was, it reminds me the kind of silencing around and the lack of imagery around abortion experiences reminds me of the very first time Time magazine published, or was it Life magazine, published a real birth of a child, an actual labor. And at first, so they sent someone out to photograph it, and he photographed it in this very kind of photorealist way, and they refused to publish it. And it's not just because it's not just about tragedy, it's because there's certain work and experiences that women and people who can get pregnant have, and we're just expected to get on with it, but not make a big fuss about it and keep it private and not bring it into this kind of political or important sphere of words, or sphere like the body politic. You just get on with your domestic stuff and don't bring it into this kind of important arena of decisions. And then the other thing I was thinking, or not that I was thinking of, that my research is about, there's a cultural theorist, Ariel Azoulay, and she talks about how because we all have cameras now, we are now all, like, if you think of a supernatural, not supernatural, supranatural, national identity of a community of photographers. And if you think of the whole wide world as its own community of photographers, then we should really be entering into this civil contract where we should be showing the things that are unacceptable, and we should be talking about it. And in photographing them and in bringing them to life, you're in some way bestowing and restoring some of those lost rights that have been taken away through the things that you're photographing. And that's something that I feel quite strongly about in the work that I do, or the people like Richard do.
There's definitely something about that exchange, maybe because of photography, because we all have this power to take photographs, it maybe allows for this, there's a lack of alienation maybe when it comes to other art forms that there might be, because people feel comfortable to be part of a conversation with photographers like yourselves, as maybe people who don't see themselves in that kind of artistic practice, but can also be truth tellers, which is really important.
But the cultural capital as well is really important, you know, like how that might exclude. I mean, you kind of mentioned that about galleries. And I think that Emma's work as an individual and as an activist, and also as a Ray collective, you know, you've been really good at traversing the different spheres, which help to make these subjects visible and audible in different, you know, to different audiences even, or to people who might feel excluded from a conversation if it's held in a gallery or if it's somewhere else. So I think, you know, there's all these different layers to it.
Mm-hmm. Talking of galleries, we've got a question which I might actually quite like to help answer as well, from Sarah, saying, we know most of the institutions of art, like galleries, have centered the white male voice and gaze. Do you have more hope in transforming those institutions to be more diverse and inclusive, or do you feel it would be more valuable to develop new inclusive spaces and platforms to share these stories and art projects that go beyond those institutional walls, i.e. virtual, the street, etc.? And just before I sort of go back to you guys, I just want to say I really appreciate Claire for pointing out the statistics of the Ulster Museum collection, because I think it's an important thing to be noted, and it's an important thing to be known. And I think for me as a curator in an institution, I can only make those changes if other people are also supporting those changes, and if those that kind of cultural need is recognised beyond just my opinion. It needs to be recognised by a community of people. And things like tonight, and people coming to talks like this, people engaging with talks like this, people visiting Claire's exhibition, the Golden Thread Gallery, help me argue for the need to make these changes, that there is a desire, there's an audience there, people want to see these narratives represented in their national institution. Your art collection is your public art collection, you own it. And it's important that you're represented within that. So I think it's about continuing these kinds of conversations. But I think what Sarah's question is interesting is this idea of, is the institution the right place to do that? Is it about institutions like the Ulster Museum and other national museums collecting works like this, or is it about creating a new space, or is it both?
I think that was your question, Anna.
I think no, I think it might have been my question. I do think it's an interesting thing, just from maybe Emma, from your perspective, that from like an, you know, thinking of it in an activist perspective, is there opportunity maybe to create a new space for this?
I mean, just because of the having nowhere else to show it. So I've done a lot of research on photography collectives in the UK, and one of my favorite stories is how excited format photography, or sorry, actually it was Hackney Flashers, got about lamination, because they could laminate their photographs and it meant that they could take them into all sorts of spaces without them getting damaged. So a lot of their pictures were around the lack of childcare. I mean, you know, we still need to talk about that as well. And called Who's Holding the Baby? And they took it to cafes, laundrettes, community halls, church halls, places where people who might be directly affected by it could actually see this and have conversations about it. And so it kind of, I suppose, inspired me to try and make the work as accessible as possible. So when you're making work like this and you have that in mind, you're not necessarily thinking about print editions, you know, or whatever. So a lot of the work is either made or shared online, or made easily shareable online. It's shown in activist spaces first, because also you need to get the people on the ground and who are affected to interrogate the work as well, and make sure that it's authentically telling the right story, and it's you're not saying anything that shouldn't be said or that they wouldn't say as well. So there's a little bit of that. But also sometimes that's why I've ended up using the streets, pasting photos on streets, or I guess jumping on hashtags that aren't intended for this work on online spaces to get the work seen as well. So a little bit of cultural hijacking, I suppose, and you know, just trying to find people who'll be supportive, and sometimes they come in unexpected places.
I think maybe in conclusion, it's just that it needs to happen in both arenas. It needs to, our national institutions need to recognise this work. It needs to happen in the streets. It needs to happen in all spaces. It doesn't need to be kind of siphoned off into a certain sort of thematic space just for this subject area. And I've seen another question there, sort of like, how does this happen? And I'd say it's starting to happen. Just thinking, you know, I included your work, Emma, in the collage show, and we are at the beginning of trying to change sort of hundreds of years of an attitude towards collecting and saying, and you know, and it's also a case of institutions, you know, we need to apply for money whenever we buy artworks, and there's a lot that goes into that, and to be able to have exhibitions like the one in the Golden Thread and these kind of initiatives, that helps us do that. So it's just about continuing to have these conversations, and also the work to be continued to be made. I think that's it. I think it's wonderful to see in that show the range of artists in sort of different stages in their career being put together, and I think it's really promising for other photographers coming up through the art college to see that this is where it can go and this is what can happen, this is the exposure I can have. So I think work just needs to continue to be made. We have another question from Eamon saying, Claire, you opened by talking about Doherty, Wiley, Seawright, who observed NI but not in a very personal way. Having seen your show today, the practice of each artist is all deeply personal. What do you attribute that shift to?
Ooh, well, I think that students bring their own perspectives, you know, and you know they're not empty boxes that arrive to get an education put into them. So, you know, I see my role as a facilitator in helping them to say the things that they want to say, to give them the tools to do that and help them to shape it into something which is as powerful as possible. So I think it's partly down to the role of the staff and the people around them, and I think in Northern Ireland, in Ulster, we really prioritize a kind of a personal connection. We have quite a nice student staff ratio, and we get to know our students really well. They get to know each other really well. And we really try and build trust amongst all of ourselves, all of us, so that we can be vulnerable, because it is actually, to make any art is really, really vulnerable, whether it's something as deeply painful as what Richard was doing, or, something entirely different, but we're laying ourselves bare. So I think that when students want to make that personal work, they feel really able to do it. And then I think as well, there's an awful lot of omissions which students can set out to try and redress. So there's a huge scope for them to make that. Whereas there's there's a huge canon of impersonal, quite detached work. So rather than replicating what already exists, I think there's plenty of room for them to go afresh into the world and say something which is personal and meaningful to them, and quite original and innovative.
I also think as well, there's sometimes a slight misnaming of the work of that very sort of topographical male territory conflict photography, because it was their background, and the sea that they swam in, and that is them reacting to it in a personal way. It's just that the standoffish macho way is a more codifiedly acceptable way of expressing that. It's just a different way of expressing it, and it's just the main way that was accepted, rather than what we're showing, which is maybe slightly more tinged with the domestic, rather than so clearly seeing the hand of the state. But it really, all of these things are political. All of these things are affected by the state. All of these things are about struggle. Just some of them aren't armed conflict, So I suppose I get annoyed because anger is still an emotion, and resistance is still an emotion. So yeah.
And isolation is still an emotion there as well, feeling isolated, which a lot of those works came from a feeling of isolation. And I think it is that thing of sort of showing a personal and political response can happen in many different ways and many different facets, and it's not sort of as clear cut as that. And it's like, even in what we're saying about what the institution represents, it still represents very important works that need to be in that collection. And I have, but it's also, it needs to be alongside this version as well, this idea that there's space for everything. And I think it's also that thing of, as you were saying, Claire, about this idea that there's this huge canon. We're all kind of trying to redefine sort of 1,000 years of art history here, and it will take a while. And I think but it's not denying that those years of art history and their influences, and that they're very important. And I think it's also, when we're talking about the likes of collections, my predecessors did wonderful things, and I know I think Kim's in the audience tonight, and she's done incredible things over the last few years and still is in sort of changing the shift of the collection. But I know she still obviously the people who came before her did incredible things for the collection and made the collection what it is, and that's why we have it. So I think it's about having this respect for what came before, but knowing we need to have wider stories. And it's just interesting actually just talking about your students, Claire, and maybe it's quite a nice way to end this evening. It's sort of, where do you see, obviously a lot of the work on display in the exhibition is graduating students of this year and people who've graduated in recent years, but sort of the ones who are now kind of coming up sort of first and second year, what are you seeing moving forward of their work? Is there sort of a similar narrative, a similar theme, or sort of what exciting things are there to come, I guess, is what I want to know.
Well, it's quite diverse, I think, really what they're doing. Certainly, I think in this graduating year, there was the beginnings of a turn to questioning masculinity in lots of different ways. And I think that was really interesting, and the beginning of something. I think performance is a big direction as well, and that's a lot down to getting Dr. Sandra Johnson on the team, and she's really nurturing that. So there's some amazing work coming out of that. And and I think that for these ceasefire babies, not all students are of that generation, of course, but we also have, you know, mature students. But those ceasefire babies, I think they are really questioning their inheritance, you know, and really quite angry about the stuff that is unspoken, you know, things that they've sort of been required to absorb without much explanation. You know, it's stuff that isn't really talked about because it's assumed to be there. And, you know, why should they have this weight pressing on them? So, and also I think they have a lot of things they want to challenge, things they want to push back against. So I see those things coming up, and I'm quite excited about them. And also I could have shown, so many students work, and, you know, and graduates and researchers in this. So it was really hard to make it just 15, but yeah, love them all.
It just shows that we need to do more of these exhibitions and more of these conversations. Well, I'm afraid there are some more questions there, but we are well over time, and I'm aware that a lot of people have given up a lot of their Wednesday evening, and thank you very much for coming along. And I just want to say really thank you so much to our three speakers this evening, and thank you, yes, as we say, for your essential work, and obviously for your wonderful sharing tonight as well. And thank you all for coming.